Professor Ed Leamer is one of America's leading economic forecasters. He's the director of the UCLA Anderson Forecast, an economic projector for California and the whole United States, and the first group to correctly predict a recession in 2001. Sydney University's US Studies Centre has been hosting Professor Leamer this week, and I spoke with him about his current expectations for the length and severity of this global economic crisis. I started by asking why the trillions of dollars being poured into the global economy don't yet seem to be having an impact.
Well, in the case of the United States, the fiscal expenditure is just barely beginning. So you'd expect it to start to kick in next quarter, the quarter after that. But I think in addition, the U.S. so-called fiscal stimulus is very poorly targeted and not particularly timely. If you want to multiply, if you want to get more than $1 worth of GDP for each dollar the government spends, you have to focus on the sectors where the job losses occurred and put those people back to work. So in the United States, that's housing, that's construction, it's automobiles and consumer durables, it's retail, and it's restaurants. So you got to have money that's spent in those sectors so it will pull those jobs back. Unfortunately, only about $8 billion out of the $780 billion is focused on those sectors. In fact, only $8 billion is distributed between houses and automobiles, which is a tiny part of the whole problem in those sectors. And I'm frankly a little disappointed in the lack of focus of this stimulus plan.
So you are saying that spending and fiscal stimulus is the key to pulling the world out of this crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about who can possibly do the spending, U.S. consumers are now saying enough. We had personal savings rates of 0 for a long time, and they jumped up from 0 to 3.8 in December, up to 5% in January. Consumers are in a very fearful mood, and they had been really the driver that pulled the whole global economy forward, and they're saying enough, we're worn out, don't expect us to do the spending. The U.S. government is one of the big potential sources for additional spending going forward.
So are you saying you do put money into consumers' hands?
Well, no, you don't go give a tax cut, say, because consumers are in a saving mood right now. They want to improve their balance sheets, as they should, because we haven't done enough saving for a long time.
So very soon the Australian government will pay many people $950. Is that a good move? Will that work?
Well, I don't know the details, but are you talking about a tax break, or are you talking about the...
It's going to be a check in the mail.
Well, we in the United States, the economy was not great, but it wasn't as terrible as it was now in the spring. And we had a big tax rebate and gave, I think it was $300 to every taxpayer. But the economists who have looked at that have discovered that about 80% of that was actually saved rather than spent. You get a pretty small spending. But now with the American consumers totally fearful, if they get that extra tax rebate, they're not going to spend that. They're going to be saving that because they feel like they've got to improve the situation. They've had such a hard hit with losses on their homes and losses on their equities. They feel like they've got to repair all that damage with more savings.
What about tax cuts? You say they're not a good idea, but our federal opposition here has been advocating tax cuts. Why are they not a good idea?
Well, at this point in time, they don't stimulate the economy. I also think that the emphasis on the part of the Republican Party in the United States on taxes is misplaced, that we should be measuring the size of government by this government spending, not by the amount of taxing that occurs. And many have thought that by cutting taxes, they would cut spending, but the opposite happens, that the tax cuts that President Bush gave us ended up allowing more spending because taxpayers are not aware of how much the government is actually spending if they're not having, on an annual basis, actually having to pay the taxes. So relieve the bad news about how much the government is spending that would normally come through the tax take, and then you get a bias in favor of more spending, deficit spending. So the U.S. is borrowing in order to finance the very high levels of spending by our federal government.